Okay everyone, so welcome to the first Q&A video. Hopefully this will start to become a fairly regular thing where I can give out as much information as possible. All you need to do is fire over any questions that you have on any of the social media platforms. So you'll see them in the bottom below. You can actually comment on this video and directly ask a question to me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. One thing I will say is social media ain't my thing. It's not something I'm that interested in, but I know that it is a necessary evil. And obviously I want to give as much information as I can. So I do tend to ramble on quite a lot. So I'll try and stay as concise as I possibly can. I've given myself a rule where I can't make any of these videos over 20 minutes long. If you want me to expand on any of the topics, or you want me to answer them, in a little bit more detail to you personally, again, just fire a message over, guys. That's the easiest way to go. Okay, so diving straight into it, all of these questions that this video I actually got through Instagram. The first question that I got was deadlift warm-up. Is there any warm-up videos that I have, or what's the kind of overall warm-up approach that I tend to take? Okay, now this is going to depend on a few different factors. The first one will be experience level within the movement itself, and then your individual build. Okay, what I mean by the experience level is what you can pull. We tend to bring the two together, but that's not always necessarily the case. It's probably better off saying absolute strength rather than experience level. But someone who is new to a movement, you do want to have a few different exercises in there, like mobility exercises and whatnot, to open up your hips, make sure that your glutes are firing, which is something we'll cover in a moment. But primarily, you just want to make sure that the movement itself is drilled down and that you have a decent amount of skill acquisition. When you first learn how to drive a car, okay, you don't just get taught how to shift with the clutch or whatever it is, how to set off on a hill and then that's it, you just go straight into it constantly. You have to repeat the process and you have to practice that same skill to be able to become proficient at it. And it's very similar with lifting, okay? It's a skill at the end of the day. Every movement that you do is a skill. We talk about form and technique and we tend to overstate its importance when it comes to preventing injury, but not when it comes to just getting stronger, okay? If you're watching this video right now, can't answer simple questions like where do my feet go when I deadlift? Do I put my hands in the consistently the same position? Is there a certain degree of rotation of my feet? Is my head position or the gaze that I'm looking at, is that constant no matter what gym I'm in, what bar I'm on, anything like that? If you can't answer those questions, then in terms of the experience level kind of assessment, you need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to building your technique. And within the warm-up specifically, just spend more time doing the same movement, okay? That will give you such a massive return on investment to prepare you for the lift than any kind of activation exercise will. Having said that, okay, if you are someone that's, and I tend to find this when I say individual build with taller people or people that have more what we'd call extreme anatomy. So there's a friend of mine, for example, he's like 6'7", I don't know, I lose track, but he spends a lot of time with me and literally throughout the day he is obviously looking down at me because I'm 5'0" if you've ever met me. I know this sounds really weird, but if we've spent the whole day together and he's been looking down constantly, he will genuinely hold himself in a slightly more flexed position. And if he's doing that day in, day out, constantly throughout the course of a week, and then he goes to deadlift, he will actually have like a slight adaptive shortening process with some muscles, and other muscles on his upper back will be locked long, so he will have to spend a little bit more time mobilizing that area to get into the position to deadlift, okay? And it's a similar case with any occupation you've got. If you're someone that's sat at a desk for a prolonged period of time, don't expect to then go from there in this seated position where your back looks like a fucking question mark and then expect to go straight into the deadlift and everything to be perfectly in line, okay? So that's the main two things that I would say there is experience level or absolute strength level and individual build. If you want in a specific movement, the hip aeroplane. I'll put a video link because I've actually got a demonstration of me doing it on here. Hip aeroplane, anyone who's worked with me will know that that's my favourite exercise anyway. I think it's unparalleled in terms of building lower body stability, okay? So moving on to the next one. Oh, bit of a different one here. Tricks to stay consistent with nutrition, okay? Right, the first thing here that you have to do is you have to ask yourself an honest question of what type of person you are, okay? It is a spectrum, but I find that people tend to exist on either end of that spectrum. If you're the type of person who there is your treat in front of you, you will eat it, there's nothing that you can do about it. Or if you're the type of person that can resist it and portion different foods, then your approaches are going to be entirely different. I'm the former in that situation. If there is chocolate in front of me or in my house in general, it will be eaten. And it will be eaten fairly quickly and I can't portion it. I'm not exaggerating with this, with chocolate. I could be 3 hours out from a weigh-in, and if someone presents me with those little Lindt bar chocolate things, I don't know if you know them, those like truffles, I'm going to eat them. There's just nothing I can do about that. And I know everyone can laugh and say, oh, it's about discipline and motivation and hard work, but the point is don't make it harder for yourself than it needs to be. It's about your environment and your behaviours that will ultimately, you don't get any extra brownie points for having resisted that throughout the course of your, quote, diet phase or just your general intuitive behaviour. So if you're that type of person, just remove the temptation in the first place. That's the number one thing I would suggest. And it sounds daft, but it can genuinely help making the tiniest adjustment, because you've got to look at it from a standpoint of like a well or a finite amount of resource that you have of your willpower throughout the course of a day. If you are drawing on that straight out the gate, early morning, and then by the end of the day, you're going to run out of it. And this is the thing that people tend to do. So your environment and behavior overall are going to have a direct influence in that scenario. Going into the actual food side of things, if I'm honest with you, because of the way that I am, drawing on my personal experience, I would say that if you are the type of person that has to go all or nothing, I would focus on routine being your number one thing. I know this sounds daft and counterintuitive to the whole flexible dieting approach, but this is just if you are that type of person. I would say routine is your friend, so have a set series of meals. They don't have to be the same every single day. You can have an A and a B week where you rotate even your shopping list every single time, but you can actually stick to the same meal, and it's already a decision that is made ahead of time, because to be brutal, you can't trust your own better judgment to come up with something on the spot that suits your goals. On the flip side, if you're the type of person that can portion things out, tends to have a little bit more of a creative approach when it comes to food, and you're not the type of person that will, quote, binge on things, but you still need to find yourself resisting a couple of the foods that you don't necessarily like, or eating in a slightly healthier setup, what I would focus on, the number one tip, is treat it as a hobby. And this might sound weird, but a lot of the problems that people tend to run into when they, quote, eat healthy is they see the foods that they like that are unhealthy as something that's more enjoyable. They have a better connection to it emotionally. It's something that's fun. It's something that they associate with social, behaviors and that type of thing, because we've all had it when you go out for a meal with your friends and you pick the healthier option and everyone seems to just slate you straight away. Weird fucking society, I know, but yeah, we tend to have that association with the unhealthy food, and then when we go healthy, we see it as something that's boring straight away. So, and I see this a lot with like vegans and vegetarians, and I made this mistake myself. Is you look at a vegan and a vegetarian person, and you think, oh well, they must just eat lettuce and I don't know, suck on a cucumber or celery or something. Probably could have picked a better vegetable there, but you know what I mean. Yeah, and when in reality, if you look at an actual someone who has been a vegan for a fairly long time, the creativity in their food is unbelievable, and it's something that you can learn from. Okay, so that's the two kind of tips I would give there. If you're the type of person that can't resist it at all, then just remove it, focus on your environment and your behavior, and just set a specific routine with a series of meals that you just stick to. Okay, and that is, there's no negotiation there. There's no flexible approach. Okay, and then on the flip side, if you are the person that can be a little bit more flexible, treat it more like a hobby. Okay, I hope that helps. Again, if you need any specific tips, just drop in a message below. Next question is building a loyal bench. Okay, I will preface this by saying my bench isn't worldly strong, partly because I think it's the most boring movement known to man. No, I'm not joking. It's not that bad. It's just something that me personally had a bit of a vendetta against it for a few years because everyone seems to be obsessed with it. But the first thing is, if you're going to focus on a movement, okay, you need to, as in you really want to build that movement, it deserves the same amount of attention and respect as the other movements. And this is the fundamental thing. Before we go into training protocols, before we go into, technical tips or anything, it needs to be down to your approach mentally. A lot of the time, people focus on squats and deadlifts a little bit more because they have to, because the weight, the absolute load that they're lifting is just heavier. It's a little bit more intimidating, and the consequences if you get it wrong are higher. So you'll inherently go into that movement with a little bit more focus. And then on the bench, because again, the opposite is true, people just tend to lay down. It's the bro movement, as we tend to call it. People don't really focus on it with the same level of intensity, okay? So that's the first thing, is if you're going to build it, you need to build it, and you need to commit to building it, okay? The next thing is stability, and anyone who, again, has worked with me or knows me, I'm probably becoming known as that stability guy, but it's just from the people that have taught me. Stability, both externally and internally, are the number one things that you need to focus on when it comes to bench, okay? Now, just to kind of table that for a second, a lot of the big bench pressers that you'll see, they tend to either A, have a huge amount of muscle mass in their upper body. It's just something they do. They bench a lot. They do a lot of upper body hypertrophy work, so they tend to just have that muscular frame that's in place, and then they can translate that over to the bench. Or they will actually have a fairly large rib cage, okay? And the reason that's important is that tends to give someone an inherently larger amount of internal stability. If you're not that type of, and you can do this, honestly, flick through Instagram, anyone who's got a massive bench, even if they're a small person, their rib cage relative to the rest of the frame is actually quite large. Going into the bench press specifically, okay, stability from an external perspective, just because you're lay down on a bench doesn't make the movement more stable necessarily, okay? It does in comparison to, you know, if you were to do that stupid thing where you lie on one of those bouncy balls, but in general, it doesn't necessarily increase stability. If anything, it can actually decrease it, because as soon as you lie down, your core activation tends to relax a little bit, so you need to create that external stability yourself. So little things like trying to create a full kinetic chain, trying to activate the muscle in your lower body to be able to stabilize your arch, for example. As a global cue, that's a key, okay? The degree at which you arch, unless you're one of these IPF benchers that can snap themselves in half and shorten the range to a tiny little, you know, the bar hardly moves, which, nothing against that, I'm just saying. Unless you're that type of person, your arch should be seen more as a method through which you create more stability rather than shorten the range of motion, okay? And if you're not getting that stability, if you're the type of person that creates this big arch, and then as soon as you lower the bar down to your chest, and then when you go to press, that arch collapses, it's completely redundant. It's a moot point, okay? So stability is the number one thing there. The next thing that I recommend personally is eccentric control, okay? Again, it harks back to the stability side of things, but there's something on a really geeky level called eccentric utilization ratio, which is basically any movement that starts eccentrically, it will go through what's called a stretch reflex, okay? So it's kind of like a bow and arrow. That's the analogy I tend to use. Is it's for you to fire an arrow out of a bow, you have to obviously draw the string back and then you can release it. And it's very similar with muscles or movements that start with an eccentric contraction. Now, the stretch reflex itself, okay, and how much of a response you can get from that is directly related to how strong eccentrically and isometrically, technically, but we'll stick with eccentrics for now, how strong you are eccentrically. If you're the type of person who, when you lower the bench, it comes down and then it drops onto your chest, that straight away, iron out that crease and build up the capacity to be able to control any weight that you have on that bar right up to your max and beyond, okay? Muscles dependent upon the movement and the individual muscle, they're up to 60% stronger on the eccentric phase alone. So if you can't control supramaximal weight right down to your chest without dropping, that right there will be the single greatest return on investment, in my opinion anyway, at building an upper body like press to be proud of, basically. Now we can go straight into the higher frequency approach, like you see a lot of lifters do, where they just slap on 3, 4, 5. I've seen some programs that are upwards of 6 days a week benching, and inherently, just by practicing that like that often and that much and doing that many reps, you will actually bring up the eccentric strength. So it's one of those things of what mechanism you use, or what tool you use, sorry, to get to the same destination doesn't necessarily matter, but that is the fundamental mechanism, is actually correcting the eccentric utilization side of things. So again, really simple from a protocol standpoint. I would literally build up to a heavy single, okay, that has around a 6 to 10 second eccentric, where you're just lowering down, and it has to be smooth throughout the movement, okay? So it's not 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5 foot like that. It has to be smooth all the way down to your chest. Strong press from there, then back off, maybe do 3 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 5, with, again, a similar eccentric like protocol. So maybe if you do 10 seconds on the single, then drop to the 3 sets of 5 and do 5 seconds on each. And again, just build up the capacity on that eccentric phase. Guarantee if you do that twice a week, you won't even need to do more than 30 or 50 working reps and your bench will go up. And if it doesn't, you can message me directly and I'll give you a protocol specifically, like I'll actually coach that movement just to make sure it does. Okay, right, next question. My bench done that. Okay, bench, squat, deadlift setup or muscle activation, okay? I probably won't cover this fully in this video because it's quite a vague question that Idris said. I'll probably message you directly, or I'll just do some specific videos on each of them. But yeah, if we're looking at specific like muscle activation, one thing I will say straight out the gate is don't confuse sensation, okay, with stimulation. And that sounds like some weird kind of porno introduction, but bear with me. Basically, the mind-muscle connection within any movement, okay, is felt at a higher degree when the muscle is in a shortened position or when it's in a lengthened position. It's very difficult to actually feel a muscle right the way through mid-range in particular, okay? You have to have volitional control of that, and even then you have to have a decent amount of mind-muscle connection. Speak to any bodybuilder and they'll tell you the same. That's one of the reasons why you can see Kai Green getting a decent arm workout with a 5 kilo dumbbell, but most people feel like they need to slap on a decent amount of weight. But anyway, getting sidetracked. Yeah, so one thing I will say is that just because you can't, or chasing the sensation within a specific muscle for a movement in the squat, the bench, and the deadlift isn't always the best approach, okay? I'll talk about specific cues and everything in separate videos, but the reason I say that is that the deadlift, dependent upon your individual build, okay, the deadlift, the squat, and the bench, they're all they're all standardized measures of strength, okay? And what I mean by that is, if that 6'7" friend of mine deadlifts the same as me, like within the same setup, I've obviously not got to travel as far to get to the bar, whereas he has, because they're on an Olympic plate at the end of the day. So for him, the deadlift might actually be an end range position, or getting into the end range for his hips, because he has to bend so far down to get to the bar. For me, it's not. It's a mid range position. And like I've just said then, if you're the type of person that in that specific movement, it's not just the deadlift, the squat, if you're only squatting to parallel, again, for you, that might only be a mid-range position, so you won't necessarily feel the muscle kick in, if that makes sense. Again, even more so on a bench. If you're someone who goes into an extreme arch when you bench press, the chances of you feeling your chest on a movement are more or less negligible. So you shouldn't necessarily chase that sensation on that movement, if that makes sense. Use other tools and other exercises to do that. That's probably the biggest mistake I see with regards like the bodybuilding approach. Just follow some of the best bodybuilders in the world. And I know you're saying muscle activation from a standpoint of strength, I get that, but just to kind of create that divide or that disparity between the two, look at some of the best bodybuilders in the world. They don't deadlift, they don't bench, and they don't squat, but they've got huge legs, huge backs, huge chests, and you know what I mean? It's all about picking the right tool for the job. But when it comes to the specific muscle activation, I'll do a separate tutorial on each video, and hopefully that should clarify what you should feel, okay? And then the final question for today's video, I can guarantee this has gone over 20 minutes, but if you're still here watching, thank you very much. Okay, so the final question is, it's a great one, this. Is it worth setting strength goals whilst also building for a marathon? 100% absolutely is, okay? Without going off into too much of a tangent, the number of times people have heard me say that, the interference effect is something that's probably, in my personal opinion, it's probably up there with sumo deadlifts are a good exercise for building glutes. It's just not like it. Yes, there's probably been 2 or 3 people in history, or 2 or 3 people in your life rather, that you know that have suffered with it, or on the flip side have been able to build glutes through sumo deadlifts. But it's probably not that is the causal mechanism. And what I mean by that is there was some research that came out like a couple of decades ago, basically finding that when you lift weights or when you ingest leucine, interestingly enough, your body releases mTOR. It's an anabolic signal that can then transfer the mechanical stress into an increased amount of muscle. And then they also found that when you do long, slow, steady state cardio, on the flip side, that can inhibit mTOR release, so it's not optimal. Now, unless you're an advanced athlete or an elite level athlete, you really don't need to worry about that, okay? What I tend to say to people is it's like looking at it, excuse me, from a financial investment, okay? And it does actually directly influence your money. If we sat down and said to you, right, you're going to run a sub 2 hour marathon, I know that's like the current world record, but you know what I mean. If you're going to run your all-time PB marathon, and you were also going to compete internationally in a powerlifting competition, okay, it is possible. Like, you can have the two, and athletes have done that before. The difference is it's going to physically, or fiscally, cost you more money because of the amount of time you're going to have to invest in recovery. Time-wise, like the amount of actual time you have to dedicate to training is also going to be a very, very influencing factor. And then just your overall energy levels in general, okay? There's loads of different variables that go into it, but the point being is it's not so much the physiological mechanism that interferes with one another. What tends to happen is, because everyone goes, oh, well, it must be the fact that I'm now running. It's like, well, it's not. It's because you've gone from training 4 times a week in the gym to now dropping to twice. The running hasn't got anything to do with it. So it's just something to bear in mind there, that everyone, like the number of conversations I have with people where they think, oh, well, I had this conversation with someone the other day where they literally thought that, and this is nothing on that person, it's just to show that there's this misunderstanding in the industry, where thinking that walking to the gym is going to influence the results. If you're Jay Cutler, yeah, pretty might do. Like, it's something you need to bear in mind, but don't worry about it, okay? Yeah, so the actual tips themselves, what I would personally recommend is, first of all, it depends on your experience level. As to where you pick the complexity of the exercise on the strength side of things that you're going to focus on. So if you're a fairly proficient lifter, you can pick pretty much any exercise that you want. But if you're fairly new to the lifting side of things, or running tends to be your emphasis, to start with, and you're just getting into lifting to help with the running, that's brilliant. But I would start with a fairly low complexity movement, so something that doesn't demand a significant amount of mobility, a high stability demand, or a high neurological component. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but the main reason being is you can get what's called like false gains, or it's not false, but what are you looking for? Are you looking at getting better at squatting, or are you looking at getting a stronger lower body? Because they're two different variables. You know, I could take you into the gym and fix your form slightly and give you an extra 5 kilos. The 5 kilos was always there, okay? I've not made you any stronger in that time frame. You're just better at expressing it. So if you're interested in getting stronger, not just getting better, then start with a lower complexity movement. The leg press, like everyone bashes on it, but it's one of the best lower body exercises in the world, in my opinion. At just building brute strength within the legs. So you could quite easily just get on that. Don't have to worry about like necessarily a significant amount of mobility, on aggravating any joint or anything like that. Because what you've got to remember is this is probably the main conflicting physiological like component is running is a fairly elastic task. Like it demands a decent amount of mobility if you're going to be efficient within it, and the muscles need to be able to recoil efficiently. Whereas a lot of like the hardcore mid-range powerlifting movements tend to be quite stiff in nature. They ask for the opposite. So rather than taking you into like a front squat position where I need you to brace everything really really hard, and we're pushing the joints to end range, it might actually be better to start with just a slightly lower skill demand movement, and then over time you can progress the complexity of the movement along with the loading, okay, and that will in turn give its own kind of benefit out of each training cycle that you do. Yeah, so you could do 4 week cycles where you stick with one movement, and you effectively just do a wave load. So yeah, so you start like a mini little peak. You start with a higher volume, you build it up, you hit a fairly heavy set, and then you change exercise and start again. What I would say is, remember that stress itself is global. Okay, so what I mean by that is if you're running a 10 kilometer run and then doing a 10 rep max squat, it's not like, oh well, this is the lifting side of my body and this is the running side of my body. They're both at the same. They both tax the same well of energy, so to speak, and well of recovery. So you need to make sure that you are keeping them in line with one another. Don't try and peak, if that's the word to use. Don't try and build up your maximum strength within that movement at that wave whilst also trying to go for a 10 kilometer run, because the running itself, the volume is higher, and obviously the volume is dropping on the lifting side of things. They tend to conflict with one another. So I personally would just have them run as two separate exercises, but along a similar kind of global effect, if that makes sense. Okay guys, so I hope all of that information was valuable, whether it was just one of the questions or all of them. If you did like the video, then please like the video. If you've got any questions, like I said, I want this to become something that's fairly routine, so please just leave them in the comments below or just fire them to me directly. Like I said, I'll put my social media again along the bottom here. Yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and as always, like and share the video. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.